Grace Morgan stood on her parents' porch 3 days before Christmas, counting trash bags. 9 of them, black and knotted, holding 34 years of her life. Above the bags, a brand new brass deadbolt caught the porch light like it was proud of itself. She rang the bell. The door opened 4 inches, caught by the chain. Her mother's face appeared in the gap. Not angry. That was the strange part. Karen Morgan looked at her daughter the way you'd look at a salesperson you didn't invite over. "The house sold," Karen said. "Closing in January. It's time everyone stood on their own 2 feet." Grace asked her to repeat it. She'd been awake since a night shift ended that morning, and she thought exhaustion was rearranging the words. It wasn't. Behind her mother, down the hall, she could see the shape of her father in his recliner. He didn't turn his head. "Mom, I gave you my paychecks for 2 years," Grace said, keeping her voice level. The voice she used with dying patients' families. Karen delivered the line she'd clearly been sharpening for a while. "In this family, love is earned." The door clicked shut, soft like a pill bottle closing. Grace stood in her scrubs while snow started to catch on the trash bags. A strange, calm thought floated up. She isn't even angry. You don't get angry canceling a subscription. You just cancel it. What she didn't know yet was why the house had to sell so fast, or where that money was already promised. 2 years earlier, Grace had been renting a small apartment across town, working hospice nursing full-time, when her mother called from a hospital hallway. Her father had suffered a stroke. "Just for a few months," Karen had said, crying in that careful way she had. So Grace gave up her lease, cut her hours, and moved back into her childhood bedroom. Karen set up a joint account, her name and Grace's, so nothing lapses while you're working nights. Every month, Grace's paycheck went in. Medication, mortgage, utilities, and apparently other things too, all swimming in the same pond. In November, checking the statement, Grace found a $9,000 transfer into a certificate of deposit under her mother's name alone. When she asked, Karen slid a folder of pharmacy receipts across the table like a closing argument. "Medicare doesn't cover everything. Do you want your father to go without?" Grace moved her direct deposit back to her own account that week. But 2 years of money already spent, legally a gift. $52,000 of it. She'd also noticed the gray SUV parked outside on Tuesdays, a man in a fleece vest photographing the fence line. When she asked, her mother didn't blink. Reappraisal for insurance. There was never a sign in the yard. Karen had sold the house quietly through a friend from church, because signs invite questions, and Karen Morgan had never once in her life invited a question. So now on the porch, Grace did the math. Her checking account, $1,100. Her car, dying, needed a transmission worth more than the car itself. Her agency shifts were cut for the holidays. Every apartment in town wanted first month, last month deposit, and proof of income that didn't reflect 2 years working for her mother's finances instead of her own. She called the police. The officer was young, kind, and useless. "You've lived there 2 years, ma'am. That likely makes you a tenant. A lockout like this isn't legal. But it's a civil matter." Civil matter. She'd learned to hate that phrase like she hated wound odor. Legal aid's line went to a cheerful voicemail. Closed for the holidays. Her friend Dana offered a couch, then remembered out loud that it was already full. Her voice went small with a shame that belonged to someone else's family, not hers. Grace couldn't force her way back in. A misdemeanor, breaking a lock on a deed she wasn't part of. And more than that, her father was behind that door, half his body still not fully his own. If she came through with a locksmith and police, whatever happened next would happen in front of him. She'd spent 10 years keeping other people's worst days calm. She wasn't going to hand him one of his own. So she waited. Politely. Like a good girl while the water rose. By Christmas Eve, her car had died completely in a motel parking lot. The buses had stopped running, and the temperature was dropping into single digits. She washed her hair in a gas station sink and told herself she was camping. Near dark, she saw a handwritten sign taped in a church window, warming center. Open tonight. All welcome. She stood across the street a long time before she crossed. There is a specific kind of pride that gets women like her killed, the ones who won't press the call button, who apologize for bleeding on the sheets. She heard her own nurse voice say out loud to no one, "Honey, you're cold and the building is warm. That's the whole of the situation." Inside smelled like coffee and wet wool. A volunteer signed her in without a flicker of judgment. She gave her name, and her voice only broke on the second syllable. They gave her a cot along the wall, under a paper angel some child had cut a little crooked. Grace lasted 20 minutes as a guest before she saw a volunteer struggling with a blister dressing, and her body just stood up and went to help. 10 years of habit wearing her legs like a coat. She sat back down afterward, and a woman settled onto the cot beside her. Silver hair in a long braid, reading glasses on a beaded chain, hands steady, eyes quick. She handed Grace a paper cup of cocoa like they'd known each other 30 years. "What's your name, honey?" "Grace. Grace Morgan." The woman set her cocoa down, slow and deliberate, and both hands rose to her mouth. Her eyes filled. "Morgan," she said. "Your grandmother, her name was Nora. Nora Hayes off Willow Lane. Nora with the tomatoes." The cold came back into Grace all at once, because her grandmother had been dead for 20 years, and nobody brought her up. In her family, Nora Hayes was a closed file. A difficult woman. A story with the ending sanded off. "Yes," Grace said. "Nora was my grandmother." The woman took Grace's hand in both of hers. Her hands were shaking. Grace's had gone very still. "My name is Diane Foster," she said. "I've been looking for you for 20 years. Grace didn't believe her. She'd seen enough elder fraud cases to know exactly how this sounded. A stranger at a shelter, a dead relative, a promise. But Diane answered every question without reaching for a note. She knew Grace's middle name. She knew about the pale scar on Nora's wrist from an oven rack in 1988, because Nora had rolled up her sleeve at their first meeting and said she wanted Diane to be able to identify her granddaughter's people by their damage. Then Diane held up her phone. A photograph of a photograph, Grace at 11, gap-toothed, standing in front of tomato steaks, holding a colander like a trophy. Grace remembered that colander. She remembered that whole afternoon, the last summer they'd let her go up there. Diane said she'd been a licensed private investigator out of the city for 31 years. In the winter, a small, straight-backed woman had walked into her office, set a folder on the desk, and said she needed someone patient. Not fast. Patient. "Your grandmother was the most organized client I ever had," Diane said. "She didn't want me looking for where you were. She always knew where you were. Same town. Same job. Same address. She wanted me to know the day you'd need me, and she spent 20 years hoping that day would never come." Nora's instructions had read less like a case file and more like a weather forecast. "Watch my granddaughter. Once a year is enough. You'll know the day when it comes." "She told me what the day would look like," Diane said quietly. "She said, my son and his wife will be done with her. She'll be standing outside their door with nothing of theirs left in her hands. It will probably be winter." Everything in Grace that was still a daughter scrambled to object. "They're not bad people. It's been a hard couple of years. Dad stroked the bills." Diane nodded like she'd heard that exact defense before. Nora used to say the same thing. In the same voice. It used to tire her out so much she'd have to sit down. Then she leaned forward and said the sentence Grace would carry for the rest of her life. "She knew they would do this to you, honey. That's why I'm here." Grace sat on that cot in a church basement and let 20 years quietly rearrange themselves. The next morning, over pancakes and cold eggs at the only diner open, Diane lifted a bundle from her tote bag, 74 envelopes tied with garden twine, every one addressed in Nora's upright schoolteacher hand to Miss Grace Morgan. The postmarks climbed 3 years of postage rates. And across the face of every single one, in her mother's own even slanted handwriting, the same verdict over and over. Return to sender. Grace laid them out in rows on the diner table while her coffee went cold. In her family, the story of Grandma Nora had exactly 3 sentences, recited whenever a child asked, designed to end the asking. She got difficult after Grandpa died. She got confused. She pulled away from the family and it broke your father's heart. Nobody confused writes 2 letters a month for 3 years. Nobody who'd pulled away kept paying property taxes on a place no one knew existed. The last envelope was postmarked in March. Diane said Nora had died that same week. If she left me something, Grace asked, why make me lose everything first to get it? What kind of love does that? Diane stirred her coffee for a long moment before she answered, and when she spoke, the words came out worn smooth, like something she'd repeated to herself for 20 years. Not while she lives under their roof. The day she's standing outside their door with nothing of theirs left in her hands, give it to her then. Before that day they would take it. And she would let them. Grace opened her mouth to argue with the dead woman, and then closed it, because she ran the experiment honestly. Say she'd been handed money and property at 25. There would have been a family meeting. Her mother saying it would be selfish to keep a windfall while the roof needed work. The phrase family money produced like a legal term. And Grace, good girl, strong one, the nurse, nodding, signing, pouring it into the same pond as everything else she'd ever earned. Her grandmother hadn't set a condition on her love. She'd written a prescription. And like all the good ones, it was exact. Do not administer until the patient can keep it down. That morning Diane made one phone call. To a man named Richard Bennett, a semi-retired attorney with an office above the bank and the unhurried patience of someone who had outlived every person who'd ever rushed him. He met them the next morning, slid a thin folder across his desk and said, Miss Morgan, I have kept a drawer locked for 20 years, and I would very much like to retire. Inside was a trust dated 20 years back. A lake cottage 40 minutes north, that Nora had bought decades earlier with money from her late sister, titled so quietly that her own son had never known it existed. An account, funded from the sale of Nora's house, had been paying the cottage's taxes and upkeep ever since, whittled down over 2 decades to a modest sum. Not a fortune, Richard said, watching her over his glasses. She was very clear it wasn't supposed to be. She said fortunes get families involved. Then he slid a small envelope across the desk. Inside was a single brass key on a loop of soft red checked kitchen string. Grace's breath caught. She knew that string. It was from her grandmother's kitchen curtains, the ones with cherries on them. She used to braid the tiebacks while Nora rolled out pie dough. She said you'd know the string, Richard said. She said that would do instead of a speech. Diane drove her out that afternoon, 40 minutes north on roads that got quieter and wider, until the lake opened up on the left like a held breath, frozen shore to shore. A small white cottage sat back behind 2 bare maples. The brass key turned like the lock had been waiting for her. Inside, the cold had the clean, still quality of a room nobody had lied in. On the kitchen table, square in the middle, sat one envelope. For my girl when they're done with her. Grace sat down in her coat and read her grandmother's letter in the fading December light. How, after her husband died, the family had begun managing Nora. The car keys first. Then the checkbook. Then the doctor's visits. They called it help. The arithmetic underneath it was her house. They'd stopped bringing Grace to visit. Told Nora she confused the children. Told Grace her grandmother had forgotten them. Nora had written anyway every month until the end. Near the bottom of the last page, in letters pressed slightly harder, her grandmother had written, You were never the debt, Grace. You were the girl. Grace stayed. It took her body a week to believe the house was hers, and she kept catching herself tiptoeing through it like a guest. That week, reading all 74 letters in order by the window, she found one from the middle of the stack that stopped her cold. It wasn't about Nora at all. They've started calling her our little nurse, and everyone laughs. I do not laugh, Grace. You are 11 years old. You've been assigned the family's pills to count the way other children are assigned the dishes. Her grandmother had watched the job description being written for Grace's entire life, while it still looked cute. In January, Grace bought a used car, transferred to a nearby bank branch, and told no one in her family where she'd gone. She wasn't hiding out of strategy. She just wanted one place on earth with no arithmetic in it. In a town that size, she got exactly 9 days. It was the new deadbolts that gave her away. Bought from a hardware store where the woman at the register sang in the same church choir as her mother's closest friend. By the following Tuesday, the family phone tree had processed, cross-referenced, and delivered its verdict. Grace Morgan is living at old Nora's place on the lake. Did you even know Nora had a place? On a Friday night in early January, her phone rang. Her mother's name lit the screen. Grace let it ring 3 times before she answered. "Sweetheart," Karen said, and her voice was warm, melted butter warm. A voice Grace hadn't heard in years. Christmas got completely out of hand. Everyone was under so much pressure. "Come home, honey. We're family." Grace listened, watching the frozen lake through the window, timing the shift in her mother's voice the way she'd time a pulse. It took 90 seconds. "Right after we miss you and it's all a misunderstanding," Karen's tone made its familiar businesslike turn. "And when you're home," she said, "we can sit down and talk about the lake place. As a family." There it was. Grace asked one question, quiet, no edge to it at all. "Mom, whose name was on the deed of the house you just sold?" The line went silent long enough that Grace could hear her mother's kitchen clock ticking behind her. Then Karen said she'd call soon, that she loved her, and was gone. She hadn't asked where Grace had slept on Christmas Eve. It genuinely hadn't come up. That was the night Grace understood, fully for the first time, exactly what kind of phone call was coming next, and exactly what her mother would want from her when it did. Grace's cousin Jade called that week, and gave her the picture nobody else would give her straight. The house hadn't sold because of the market. It sold because of the math. 2 years of her father's rehab copays. A home equity loan Grace never knew existed. Credit cards. Back taxes. They'd closed fast and low, and after the debts, there wasn't much left. Her parents were renting a 2-bedroom condo by the highway. "Aunt Rebecca's been telling everyone you came into Grandma Nora's money," Jade said, apologetic, like she was handing Grace something with a sharp edge. "Nobody even knew there was money. Mom's been on the phone about it for days." So that was the machine, and Grace finally saw it whole. She hadn't been kicked out in a fit of cruelty. She'd been liquidated, calmly, like the house. An asset that had stopped producing, cleared off the books before the move. It was somehow worse knowing that. You can't hate a spreadsheet. That same night, her phone rang again and the screen said Dad. Her heart did something complicated, because her father hadn't dialed a phone on his own since his stroke. She picked up and heard the long, effortful breathing first, then his voice dragging its left side, each word hauled up alone. "Your grandma," he said. A long pause. "Made good pie." That was all. Somewhere behind him, a television murmured, and then the line went dead. She never knew if he hung up or the phone just slipped from his hand. 2 days later, an envelope came from her mother. Thick paper, a dinner invitation. New Year family dinner, Aunt Rebecca's house. Saturday at 6. Please come. We all want to start fresh. Diane read it on the table without touching it, the way you'd look at a mousetrap. "They'll have an agenda," she said. "And you're the only item on it." Grace knew that. But some old ancient part of her heard "we all want you there" and sat up like a dog at a can opener, because wanting your family to want you isn't a character flaw, whatever it costs. She'd wanted it for 34 years and didn't know how to stop on 2 weeks' notice. But she'd changed in one measurable way, and she felt it as she got ready. She wasn't bringing anything they could deposit. No checkbook, no paperwork, no decisions. She made a pie instead. Her grandmother's crust, cherry, lattice top, practiced twice beforehand. If you think a pie is nothing, you never learned what a grandmother could say with one. They were lovely for 20 minutes. Grace wants that on the record because it makes what happened at minute 21 easier to believe, not harder. Her aunt hugged her at the door. Her mother said the pie was beautiful. Her father sat at the end of the couch with his walker parked beside him, and when Grace kissed his cheek, his good hand found her wrist and pressed it twice like a code. Then the plates were cleared, and her mother set her coffee down with a click that called the room to order. She had printed pages, a market analysis for a lakefront property, a suggested listing price highlighted in yellow. They'd had the cottage appraised before they'd even asked Grace to hand over the keys. "Your father needs real care, Grace," Karen said, in the reasonable voice that arrives pre-insulted for when you disagree with it. "More than I can give with my back. That place is just sitting there. Nora was family, she'd have wanted it to take care of family. We sell it, we set your father up properly, and everything goes back to normal." Heads nodded around the room. Grace asked what normal meant exactly. Her mother smiled like Grace had finally asked a smart question. "You come home, sweetheart. We get a place with room for you. You help with your father. You're the nurse." She reached for Grace's hand across the table. In this family, love is earned, Grace. Your father earned yours the day you were born. There it was. The whole religion in 2 sentences with a yellow highlight. Grace set her fork down. She remembers the sound it made. That small, clear bell of it, because the room had gone that quiet, waiting for the strong one to say of course. She spoke in the voice she used at 3 in the morning when a family wanted a feeding tube that would only prolong the dying, level, kind, and without give. No, she said. She would not be selling her grandmother's house tonight or ever. And because she'd spent 2 weeks getting ready for this table, even if she hadn't admitted it to herself, she laid out what she'd do instead. She'd already pulled every discharge summary and medication list from 2 years of her father's care. She named the Medicaid waiver program the 3 facilities she'd toured, the one with the stroke unit where she knew the charge nurses by name. She would be his care coordinator herself. Free. Forever. Every appointment, every medication review, her number first on every chart. I'll give him my hands and my head, she said. The house stays my grandmother's. Her aunt actually stood up. After everything your mother has sacrificed. Her mother went white, then wet-eyed in a single practiced motion. Only her father didn't move. Grace gathered her coat, thanked her aunt for dinner, and left the pie behind. The story was loose in the family by Monday, and it was a good story if you didn't know her. Grace got secret money from crazy old Nora and turned her back on her dying father. 2 aunts quietly dropped out of her life. No announcement, just text that stopped mid-conversation, like a road washed out. Grace felt every hit. Then Jade called late one night, working through her own guilt about her mother, and in the middle of apologizing, handed Grace the missing page of her whole life. You know Aunt Rebecca did it too, right? The paycheck thing. Jade told her what her mother had once let slip at Thanksgiving wine loose. That Karen at 19 had worked the line at a plant and handed her paycheck to her father every Friday sealed. That she'd been accepted into a nursing program in the city. Nursing of all things. And her father had told her a family wasn't a boarding house you left when it suited you. So she stayed. She met Grace's father at that plant. She never mentioned the nursing program again. Grace sat with the phone warm against her ear and felt something she had no room for. Pity with rage still wet underneath it. Her mother hadn't been born holding a ledger. Somebody had handed it to her at 19, at a kitchen table just like this one, and nobody had ever told her she was allowed to set it down. Understanding that changed nothing about the locks. It changed everything about her aim. Ordinary life ticked along after that. She fixed the porch step. She took good shifts at the local bank branch. Diane showed up Sundays with flowers and did the crossword out loud in the rocking chair like she owned the place. By day, Grace was honestly happy. It was 3 in the morning that had teeth. She'd wake with her heart going, her brain already deep in the old arithmetic. If I sold. If I signed. If I just went back and took the couch and the night shifts, Mom's voice would go warm again by spring. Being needed had been her job, her rank, her whole face in that family for 34 years, and quitting it felt less like freedom and more like withdrawal. On the worst of those nights, she did the only thing that helped. She wrote to her father, just to him. A short letter in large print for his good eye. The 3 facilities, what each cost, what Medicaid covered, her new number. At the bottom, Dad, I'm not gone. I'm just done being the budget. Love, Grace. She mailed it to the condo on a Tuesday. 2 weeks later, it came back to her mailbox at the lake. Her own envelope, her own handwriting, and across the front, in that same even slanted cursive, the same old verdict. Return to sender. Grace stood at the mailbox on a gray February afternoon and understood she was holding letter number 75. Same hand. Same words. Same job that hand had been doing for 20 years, standing between a Morgan and somebody who loved her for free. Diane's voice came back to her on the wind, like a diagnosis confirmed by a second lab. She knew they would do this to you. There were no tears left in the account for her mother. She untied the garden twine, set her own envelope on top of the stack, and something about the click of that completion was the coldest thing she'd felt all winter. It was a Friday night in early February when the phone rang at 11. Jade crying before she got the name all the way out. It's Uncle Mark. Another stroke, a big one. They took him to County General. Aunt Rebecca's telling the doctors his daughter's a nurse and she's coming to take him home. Grace drove the 40 minutes with the roads black and glittering, and used every mile of it to decide who was walking into that hospital. 2 women could make that drive. One was the little nurse, arriving to be spent. The other was somebody she'd been building for 6 weeks in a house by a lake. She walked in as both his daughter and a professional, and asked the resident 3 questions. Swallow study, anticoagulation window, what they were thinking for discharge. She watched him recalibrate who he was talking to. Through the glass of the family lounge she could see her mother watching her. Not with relief exactly. Some of it was real fear for a husband at 2 in the morning. But over it, moving like a hand across a column of figures, was a look Grace had finally learned to translate. Her mother was counting. The nurse had come back. The asset was in range. The discharge meeting was Monday morning. Formica table, a box of tissues, an air purifier humming one flat note the whole time, like the building holding its breath. The clinical picture came first. Her father would need skilled nursing, 24-hour care, a stroke recovery program, a hospital bed, a lift, a trained caregiver essentially around the clock. Her mother folded her hands on the table and arranged her face into its warmest, most reasonable setting. "My daughter is a nurse," she told the social worker, gesturing at Grace like unveiling a solution. 10 years experience with exactly this. And she has a whole house standing empty out on the lake. His own mother's house. Room for the equipment. He'll be with family, which everyone knows is better than any facility. The social worker looked at Grace. Her mother turned to her too in front of everyone, and said the line she'd been saying in one form or another since Grace was 11 years old, counting pills into a saucer while the grown-ups called it adorable. She said it kindly. That's the detail worth keeping. She said it with love, the only love she had. The kind with a balance owing. You're the nurse, Grace. This is what you're for. The air purifier hummed. 20 years stood quietly behind her chair. A shelter cot, a brass key, 75 envelopes, all waiting to hear what she'd say. Grace turned to the social worker first, because the system deserved a clean answer before the family got its speech. "I do not consent to being the discharge plan," she said. "A single caregiver working shifts cannot safely provide round-the-clock stroke care alone in a private home. That arrangement fails the patient first and the caregiver second." She'd seen it fail twice over. Then she turned to her mother and gave her the rest in the flattest, gentlest voice she owned. She'd toured 3 facilities in January, before any of this happened, because she'd read her father's first stroke records and done the arithmetic herself. One had a stroke unit and a bed opening. His Medicaid application was already drafted, sitting in a folder in her car. "I'll be his care advocate on every chart," she said. "First call, every conference, every medication review, every Tuesday, forever free. You get my hands and my head for the rest of his life. What you don't get is the house, the account, or me. Not anymore." Her mother's voice climbed. "After everything. Selfish. Your own father." The older Grace got, the more she understood that shouting is just a ledger being read aloud. She waited it out like weather. Then she said the last part, the part she'd spent 34 years drafting. "You taught me love is earned in this family, Mom. I'm done earning. I'm going to love him for free from my own front door. You've never once seen what that looks like. Watch me." Her mother stood slowly, gathered her coat, her purse, her printed pages nobody had looked at, and delivered the sentence the whole religion had been building toward since before Grace was born. "Then you have no family." She walked out. Her aunt followed, already glaring on her sister's behalf. Into the ringing quiet after the door closed, the social worker slid a single form across the table. "The county will need one point of contact for his care decisions going forward. Whom should I list?" Grace printed her own name in the box. Under relationship she wrote daughter, and her hand was steady the whole way. She didn't leave the building. There was one visit left. She sat by her father's bed in the tomb, quiet, monitors keeping soft green time, and told him the truth slowly at eye level, like a grown man who deserved his own life explained to him. Where he was going. Why? That she'd picked it herself back in January. That she'd be there every Tuesday. His left hand came across the blanket and gripped hers hard. The way he used to test whether a jack would hold before sliding under a car. His mouth worked at something slurred, dragged uphill the whole way, and she will hear it in every quiet room for the rest of her life. Nora's girl. He knew. He'd maybe always known behind that window. In that silence she was still learning to forgive. Her father moved into the stroke unit the 3rd week of February. Window bed, a courtyard with a bird feeder. A yellow lab that visits on Thursdays. Grace is there every Tuesday with coffee for the charge nurse and the newspaper for him. Some weeks she brings the letters and reads them aloud, one at a time, her grandmother's voice in her own mouth. He listens with his eyes on the ceiling and his good hand gripping hers at the same places every time. Her mother visits Sundays. The staff figured out the choreography inside a month. 2 shifts, no overlap, nobody ever having to say it out loud. Grace understands her mother now, which isn't the same as letting her back in. The brass key lives on a nail by the cottage door these days. Did its work. It's just a house key now, resting on its loop of red checked string. Some evenings she takes out the last letter and reads the closing line the way other people say grace. You were never the debt. You were the girl. It took 20 years, 9 trash bags, and a cot in a church basement. But she believes it now. Any love that hands you a bill isn't love. It's rent. The people who really love you leave the door unlocked and the key on a string, and never once send you the invoice.